All right, good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to be talking about bringing Sculpin to life, which is my story about how I brought an open source project from nothing, from just an idea, to an actual project. And the project we're going to be talking about is my project Sculpin. It's a static site generator written in PHP. If you haven't used a static site generator before, its whole purpose is to generate a collection of static content that can be published to any web server. Before we talk about the story too much, I want to talk a little bit about myself. I've been programming professionally since 1998, and for the majority of my career, I've been a lone wolf developer. That means that I've been working either completely by myself, very small teams, or as a remote contributor to a larger team working on really isolated projects. As a result, I've sort of gotten some really ingrained, non-admitted here tendencies, which means that I tend to reinvent the wheel a lot. I have a lot of code that I've written in the past that was just my code. It didn't involve code from anybody else. So now that we have that little bit of my history out of the way, I can get started talking about how Sculpin came to be. And a project doesn't just materialize out of nothing. It usually has a story. And the idea of Sculpin I can trace back to some time that I spent in a project called Beer and Code Seattle. It was a community of developers who were across multiple languages. Their whole idea was that they were going to meet at a bar every 2 weeks, drink beer, and write code. I don't drink beer, but I do write code, so I wanted to be involved in this community and sort of get out of my isolation a little bit. So I got involved virtually with them quite a bit and wanted to help in any way that I could, so I wanted to help with the website. So as a part of the website project, one of the other developers in the group put together the first website based on Jekyll. And Jekyll was a static site generator. And this was the first experience I'd had with Jekyll or static site generators, but I really liked the idea. Just looking at it initially, I was like, wow, this could be really useful. I don't exactly know how to use it. But it sort of set something in my mind at that point that, wow, this looks like something cool. I don't know if there's anything like this in PHP. Meanwhile, at this point in my career, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, I was sort of at a crossroads with PHP. I started developing in PHP a little bit as early as 2002. By 2005, I was developing in PHP full-time. There's a lot of really weird code in there, a lot of really bad old PHP 4 code, for example. But I was really enjoying PHP, and I'd been using it for quite a while. I'd created a bunch of my own code. As I mentioned, I had a lot of my own libraries, a lot of my own frameworks. I'd spent a year working in Java and got familiar with Spring Framework. So I started writing a little inversion of control container based on Spring Framework's container. I wrote a web framework called Halo that was sort of loosely based off of Spring Framework as well. And I had an ORM called Repos that was based loosely off Hibernate and SQL Alchemy from Python. I started building some pretty big applications on these libraries, and pretty soon reality started to hit me a little bit, that I was spending all of my time implementing features in my framework and not able to really implement the actual application logic that was going to get these projects moving. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it and finally realized that maybe it was time for me to find something else. That my time could be better spent actually implementing features for the applications that I was writing rather than spending all of my time reinventing things that people have already solved. There were problems that I didn't need to solve anymore. And it was pretty good timing because right around then, Symfony 2 was well under development and it was promising components, which was something new. I hadn't really seen anything like this in the PHP community before. Most of the frameworks that I'd seen, like Cake and CodeIgniter, even Symfony 1s and Framework, they were all vertical silos. You bought into the framework and you used them wholesale. There were a few edge cases like Smarty and things like that that you could kind of bolt onto some things sometimes, but for the most part there weren't these components. So I was really intrigued by this. At the same time, I'd been stuck in PHP 5.2 up until that point, but PHP language itself was kind of going through some transitions as well. And specifically, what I was interested in with PHP 5.3 was namespaces. I'd really grown to like packages in Java and modules in Python and all these other languages that had better ways to organize code. So I was excited that PHP had namespaces until I started looking at the implementation. And I absolutely hated the / operator. I don't know why, at the time I didn't know why they picked it. I saw the selection of optional choices and one of them was a smiley face. And I thought, what is wrong with PHP? And I seriously considered leaving PHP. I spent probably 6 months looking at other alternatives. Like I had enjoyed my time working with Spring Framework in Java. Maybe I could do some Java stuff. Maybe I could explore Scala. I spent a lot of time really seriously considering this. And between the idea that I might consider walking away from my own code that I'd been basically growing for 10 years, and the fact that I might also walk away from my programming language of preference, it was a really bad time for about 6 months. I wasn't very happy. So going back to the other part of the story, I had been continuing to spend some time with Jekyll. I fired up maybe 2 or 3 websites with it. I was starting to get more comfortable with it, but also I was really not liking the developer experience. A lot of that comes down to Ruby's reliance on monkey patching. It made it really difficult to compose pieces from different websites. Like I would go to one Jekyll website and say, oh, that's cool, they're doing that. Try to figure out how to do that on my site, and like all these weird files would be in weird places, and it would conflict with some other plugin that I had pulled from another site that also did monkey patching on the same thing, and it was really bad. So I was really, really, really not happy with the state of Jekyll for extensibility purposes. So I went back to the Beer and Code Seattle IRC channel and said, hey, what should I do? I kind of like Jekyll. I'm having a hard time making anything look nice and do cool things that I'm expecting to be able to do with a website. And someone recommended checking out Octopress. So by this point, I had actually already created my blog in Jekyll. So I had created a new post called Octopress versus Jekyll Fight, because I wanted to see whether or not Octopress could actually compete with just writing pure Jekyll websites. So that set me on a little venture of actually going into Jekyll and Octopress and doing a bunch of contributions and figuring out how they tick, how they work. And so I spent some time actually learning these really well, because I really liked this idea of static site generator of, the code that we write isn't actually needing to be executed every single request. You can cache these things in some frameworks or whatever, but really we're just creating static HTML. There's no reason for a blog or a landing page to actually have any dynamic component ever. So I was really excited about this, so I started to spend a lot of time in these projects. Meanwhile, back in PHP, I'd sort of come out of my funk a little bit. I had landed on using Silex. Symfony full stack framework was a little too much for me. There was a lot of overhead, a lot to learn. The bundles were really pretty beefy, hard to get into for me. It was too much. It was too opinionated for my liking. And Silex was just enough below that I could still use Symfony's components. I could still use HTTP Foundation and learn these things without having to buy into the full stack Symfony framework. The other interesting thing about Silex was that initially it was distributed as a FAR. I hadn't really had much experience with these before, but I liked the idea that you could ship a library or an application and ship all of its dependencies together so that you didn't have to worry about downloading all of these other things and where do I put them in my file system. I wasn't sure how I could use this, but it intrigued me, and I wanted to make sure and remember to do something with that at some point. And since I was working with Silex, I was still involved in the Symfony community. I was still having to follow along with HTTP Foundation and all the other components that Silex was using. I still had a long-term goal of eventually doing more with Symfony, but I wasn't actively using it at the time. One of the things that I did like about the full stack framework was that it shipped with something called vendor.sh. This was a way that Symfony had decided to use to get all of the dependencies for the full stack framework to the developer. And this solved a lot of problems that I'd had over the years on my own projects, trying to get other people's libraries in. So you could specify, I want Doctrine at this version, I want Twig at this version, and I want all of these other all of this code from other people at specific versions. It was handled in a pretty nice way, but it wasn't very scalable. It wasn't something that it was like an application that you could, I couldn't take vendor.sh and just use it outright in my own application. It still required basically copying and pasting, which I didn't like too much. And apparently other people were onto this problem as well, and I started to hear people whispering about Composer. I didn't really pay attention to it right away. I just heard it in passing every once in a while, and at some point, someone asked something about vendor.sh, and we need to fix that or whatever, and someone said, oh, well, Composer is going to do that, or Composer is going to fix that for you. And I was like, wait, how does that play? What does that have to do with anything? So I found my way to the Composer dev channel. And I would say within a day, I realized that this was the future of PHP. All of the problems that I'd ever had with distributing code, using other people's code, everything that sort of forced me into building my little silos of my own code, Composer solved. It solved it in a really, really nice way. So I attribute me falling back in love with PHP to Composer. Like that was really what set me back on the path of saying, okay, I'm going to stick with PHP. I enjoy PHP. It has a future. So I really think that Composer had a huge deal to do with that. I also started to really love the way that Composer was built. It was a Symfony 2 console application, which I had never really looked at before. I knew that there was a console command in Symfony, but I thought it was Symfony specific. So I got a little more exposure to the actual console, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. I like how this works. I wonder what I could do with that. So I started to get these ideas in my head, and I wondered what could I build as a console application for PHP? I spend a lot of time in the console, and I spend a lot of time writing PHP. What could I build that could be really cool that does both? And I really liked the way that Composer did dependency management. And I thought that would be a really great way to deliver plugins to an application. So I thought, what could I build that could use Composer as a way to offer extensibility? I also really wanted to build something that would let me use more Symfony components. Like the console component looked interesting. The dependency container, the event manager. There were a bunch of different components that I'd only loosely looked at, and I wanted to have a way to actually work with them a little better. And I also thought it might be interesting to look into this whole FAR thing. What could I do with that? So this is where the stories sort of converge. I was already on this path using Octopress and Jekyll and had made these contributions, and things were starting to fall apart a little bit for me. I was still struggling with Octopress. There were some actual core functionality problems that I had with Jekyll that I didn't think were ever going to be fixed because it was just the way it was, and it wasn't going to change. And I didn't know enough Ruby to actually make any good ways to fix that without breaking everything. So I was already kind of on the fence with continuing to use Octopress and Jekyll. So I thought, what if I built a static site generator in PHP? Which goes back to the very first thing I thought was, is there one? I started to float this idea around in the Composer channels, and I got some pushback. I got told by a couple of people that there's already CMSs in PHP. In fact, there's too many CMSs in PHP. We don't need another one. And specifically, there's this thing called Frozen. So go ahead and build it, but don't bother promoting it because there's already a static site generator for PHP. And I was like, Frozen? What's Frozen? So apparently I didn't look very hard for PHP static site generators because there was Frozen. And there were actually probably 2 or 3 other relatively popular ones at that time already that I just didn't know about. I didn't ask the right questions. I didn't do the right Google searches. So I spent some time looking at Frozen. It was actually a relatively new project, but it was completely built around pair. And I was prepared to never touch anything pair related ever again. But in the spirit of trying to help out, I actually looked at it, tried to make sure that it wasn't going to work for me. It was different enough from the way that Jekyll organized things that I wasn't super comfortable with it. So I decided that I probably wouldn't use Frozen long term. But I was still left with the question of, should I do this anyway? So I kind of waffled for a little bit. I wasn't sure. I had all this pushback from the community. You don't really need to do that. It wasn't real hard pushback, but it was enough to plant that doubt in my brain that maybe I shouldn't build this. Like, why are people going to be upset with me for building it? It was really difficult for me to get past that. So I decided that if I was going to do this, I needed to find some justification for it so that I could defend the fact that I wanted to build this thing that didn't need to be built. One of the big things that I came up with was I actually spent a considerable amount of time working on directly and with Octopress and Jekyll, and they didn't work for me. I was having issues with it. There were pull requests that had been open for months that I wasn't getting any feedback on. Meanwhile, I was maintaining this fork, and they were diverging, and it was getting to be something that I wasn't really super happy with. One of the core problems I had with Jekyll was the way that it implemented templates with Liquid. Liquid is a templating engine, very similar to Twig in PHP. Actually, I think they probably came from each other, but the other way around. And the way that they handled template inheritance wasn't very good because it wasn't there. Jekyll implemented it such that each individual source would be rendered into its own variable and injected into a Liquid template. That meant that you couldn't do any interesting things with template inheritance, like setting template variables at the level of individual pages. That just wasn't possible. So it made working in Jekyll templates really, really complicated because you couldn't do some simple things that you could do otherwise if you were doing inheritance. I had tried Frozen. I looked at it. I tried it. It just didn't feel right to me at all. The architecture was completely different than I had expected. There were some weird little things about it, like the fact that the extension had to be dot markdown because of the way that it picked the parser was it did string to lower and then string to up, the first case to upper on the class name to pick which class it was going to load for the markdown parser. So if I wanted .md files, I would have to create a .md class file. It just seemed like going through those sorts of architectural decisions, I didn't want to have to do that. And I didn't want to name my files .markdown. I just wanted to have the flexibility to do what I wanted. It also had the same issues with Twig. It rendered each individual source as its own variable and injected it into a Twig template. So it had the same sort of problems that I had with Jekyll, with Liquid, and the way that it did that. And so I really wanted to find something that could do templates. Frozen actually had some interesting ideas for extensibility, but Jekyll's never really had like a first-class plugin system that was really easy to use, short of copying and pasting code. So I really wanted to solve that problem, and I really wanted to solve it with Composer. And this ultimately was the thing that finally pushed me over to doing this, because I felt like implementing this is something that the community could use, and it was something new, and it was different enough that it justified building something from scratch that already existed, but in such a way that it could account for this from the beginning. So I decided to go for it. But with any open source project, first you have to have a name, because you can't do anything until you have a name for a project. And so I landed on the name Sculpin. I spent way too long figuring out which name I wanted to call this. But yeah, I couldn't do anything until I had a repository name. So once I had the name picked out, I created a repository, and within 5 days of finally picking the name, I had my first commit to Sculpin. So the very first working version of code that did something, probably not much, was on December 21st, 2011. And this is where things really started kind of getting a little interesting. I had to pick a core architecture, and as I mentioned already, I sort of landed on the idea of using Composer as a base because I really liked how Composer worked. I wanted to find a way to do extensibility, so I built a homegrown idea for bundles, loosely based around what Symfony was doing, except I wasn't using Symfony itself. But then I got stuck in some rabbit holes. I ended up working quite a bit on Composer Core. There were some things that needed to be done in order to make Composer extendable or embeddable that really needed to be worked on in Composer itself. So I spent a good amount of time learning Composer internals, refactoring a bunch of stuff. The main Composer installer class was the direct result of me basically extracting that out of another class, which enabled me to start working on embedding Composer. I also spun out a bunch of different libraries. As I worked on stuff that I needed to use to support Sculpin, I realized that I was solving generic problems. And since packages was just a new thing, there weren't a lot of packages that I could find, so I started writing my own libraries for a bunch of things, which was a lot of fun, and that just made me all the more excited because I'm actually sharing code now that my own packages, my own projects are using code that I'm sharing. I was pretty excited about that, and Composer just made everything so much easier. By February 1st of 2012, Sculpin's website was self-hosted. Meant that Sculpin's website was actually generated by Sculpin, which seemed like a pretty interesting milestone for me. I was kind of excited about that. By the middle of February, a couple of weeks later, I had managed to migrate my blog that had previously been an Octopress blog to be generated by Sculpin. So that was a pretty big deal for me, because that meant it was feature complete enough that I could generate my whole blog using Sculpin. Not long after that, the maintainer of Octopress closed all of my PRs. No comment. And that's when I realized that I'd made the right choice with not sticking with Octopress anymore. I think they had just declared PR bankruptcy, because some of those PRs had been open for months. So I didn't feel too bad about it, but I realized that I was doing the right thing. I eventually decided that I was doing too much work building the bundle system when Symfony had one that I was emulating. So I switched Sculpin to actually use Symfony's bundle system. And eventually I finished implementing Embedded Composer inside Sculpin's namespace itself. And nobody was really using it, I wasn't really using it, but I actually had an implementation that worked, that I had tested, that proved out the concept. I eventually worked with the React project, which was pretty awesome, to embed a web server in Sculpin. I had initially thought I could use PHP 5.4's internal web server, but it doesn't work that way. So fortunately, there was the React project, which was doing some really awesome things with asynchronous programming in PHP that let me have an embedded web server that ran in addition to my long-running Sculpin processes. And I fixed the twig inheritance problem, which is a technical discussion for another time, but the solution I'm pretty happy with, other than the fact it's mostly based on regular expressions at this point, but I don't really know a better way around it. So until then, this works really well. All along the way, I was getting more excited about community. I hadn't been to a conference since a Perl conference back in 1999 or 2000. So I decided that with my newfound Symfony experiences, I would try to go to Symfony Live in San Francisco in 2012. Had a blast. I got to meet Jordi there. I'd been working with him off and on IRC, and we got to meet in person. So that was really great. He was the only person I knew going to the conference, and I met a ton of people there that I've still kept in contact with. But it was really great to be able to have that first experience of meeting a developer that you've only worked with online and actually get to meet them and talk to them in person. It was pretty cool. I also met someone by the name of Jacob Mather, which he'll come into the story in a little bit. And I had my first hack day, which was a lot of fun. Since I had met Jordi in person, I'd been begging him to bump the version of Symfony that Composer was using to a higher minor version of Symfony components. And he made a deal with me that if I implemented the tilde operator, he would bump the version of Symfony that Composer was using to tilde 2.3 instead of just 2.3, I think 2.3 or 2.4, whichever it was. So my first hack day was implementing the tilde for Composer, which was a lot of fun. All in all, you might pick up that I'm really liking community. I had a lot of fun with it. I started to crave it, but at the time I was pretty isolated. I lived in North Dakota. The nearest PHP programmer to me was like 600 miles away. It was really, really not a good time. So I was now just starting to see like, community is great. I love it. I want to be by people, but I can't really be by people. So it was kind of hard, but eventually I moved on to a different place that had more people around, which was awesome. And now I'm here, so I'm around a lot of programmers, which is great. At the end of 2012, I finally extracted Embedded Composer from the Sculpin namespace into its own namespace, which meant that other people could use it. Around that time, I also submitted my first talk proposals. As I mentioned earlier, I met Jacob Mather, and he did a talk. He did a lightning talk at Symfony Live, and I found out later that was his first talk he'd ever done, and it kind of blew me away. I was like, how could someone just get up and talk without ever preparing or anything like that? So he was really, really instrumental in helping me get excited to come to talk and realize that you don't have to be anyone special to go talk. You have to have something interesting to talk about, and other people, like everyone's going to find something interesting to talk about that someone else might be interested in listening to. So you don't have to be special to talk. So he helped me understand that, and so I submitted a bunch of talks, including Embedded Composer. And I sent out 5 conference proposals, got 4 rejections back, and started to get very sad. I was like, this is not going to work. And I know now that you get more rejections than you get acceptances ever. So I'm starting to learn that, but at that point I hadn't learned that lesson yet. So I was getting kind of sad about it, and started thinking, why am I doing this? No one cares. Why would anyone want to listen to me? And then I got an acceptance letter to go speak at Symphony Live in Portland on Embedded Composer. So I was really excited about that. I still hadn't really talked about Sculpin much. I talked about it a little bit in Composer channel. When anything Embedded Composer related came up, I would talk about Sculpin a little bit. But I started to wonder, why am I not talking about Sculpin more? I've been using it. It's been around for over a year. I've built a bunch of sites with it. A couple of people have found it, and they're using it. Why am I not talking about it? And it came back to this fear that I had initially that I shouldn't talk about it. People told me, don't try to promote it. It's just another CMS. We don't need another one muddying the waters. But at this point, I realized it was time to change that. So a big chunk of the Embedded Composer talk was Sculpin's origin story. Because that is the reason Sculpin existed, was because I wanted to do Embedded Composer. So I had a chance to actually talk about it. So I went all out. I branded the slides Sculpin. The first third of the talk was all about Sculpin. The logo was everywhere. All the colors were in there. I got stickers. So everyone got stickers. And I have stickers now. If anyone wants stickers later, come find me. Get some awesome stickers. And I got shirts. I printed like 5 shirts. I went way all out because I was excited about it. Because it's sort of been building up over this time. So I was really excited. And it was a great launch. It wasn't like this massive thing, but all of a sudden people had heard about it, and people started to find it. Like magically now, people were finding it. The slides for Embedded Composer were shared. The video for Embedded Composer was shared. People were slowly starting to see Sculpin, and as they would see that, they would talk about it a little bit, and yeah, I just started to go from there. So I guess the end of my talk now is kind of the beginning of the next talk. The next talk is actually going into maintenance. How do you maintain an open source project? Creating the project is a huge thing to do, and it can be a lot of work, and it can be kind of stressful if people are giving you negative feedback or whatever. But since then, it's been a completely different thing. So we don't get to talk about that now, though. So I want to go back to some of the points. I just want to say this again, that reinventing the wheel is not always bad. That's kind of been the overall point that I've been trying to get at, that not invented here is sort of seen as a negative thing sometimes. Reinventing the wheel is seen as a negative thing sometimes. It's definitely been a theme over the last week or two. On Twitter, on Reddit, the community is talking about this. Does it make sense to create something that already exists? And I think that it's a fine line, but I do know that by pushing people out in any way, saying that you shouldn't do that, it can hurt them a lot. It held me back quite a bit by not wanting to talk about it, by feeling bad about the code that I'm writing, even though it was really cool code. It had a lot of really interesting things in it. Just one person telling me, we don't need another CMS in PHP, was enough for me to really think about that, and it really permeated my entire project for a long time, that I shouldn't talk about this. Like anytime I talked about it, anytime I mentioned the name Sculpin, I kind of felt dirty. And it's wrong. I shouldn't have felt like that at all. I think there's a fine line. I think that if there are existing projects that do what you want to do, you should try them, because it's possible that they work for you, or it's possible that you could contribute to them in a way that will make them better. But don't not create it just for the sake of not creating it because other things already exist. Because if those things aren't what you want, if those things don't work for you, you shouldn't feel bad about that. In my particular case, I found that finding justification for reinventing the wheel was pretty helpful. Even if your justification is because I want to learn how to build a router in PHP, do it. But know what your reasons are. Don't do it just because that's your default is I want to recreate this from the beginning. Find what your reasons are and justify it at least to yourself so that you know why you're doing it. Build something that excites you. If you're really excited about it, just build it. Like I was super excited about it, I should have just built it. I should have just done it from the beginning and not worried about it. And definitely if you can use it, you should build it. If there's something else out there that sort of works but doesn't work exactly what you need and you can build it, just build it. and you can figure out the rest later. Maybe you don't have to promote it, but that's fine. You're going to use it, and that's pretty much all you need. Make sure you're in community. You're all here, so you're already probably going in that direction. But if you've come here by yourself and haven't talked to anybody and haven't met anybody, see what you can do to try to talk to someone. If you're here with a small group of developers from your work and you're just the three of you talking together and you're going to go home and never talk to anybody else, try to get involved. Try to get involved on Twitter, IRC, Reddit, somewhere. Try to get involved so that you can start leveraging what you know and what other people can share as well. Remember, PHP is flexible. Over the last couple of years, PHP has been really pushing the limits on what it can do, especially with projects like React. With asynchronous PHP, that wasn't something that even was an idea a couple of years ago. There's a lot of things you can do. There's also a lot of PHP applications now that are command line applications, long-running processes. PHP can do a lot. It's very flexible. Just because another language might do it better initially doesn't mean that it can't be done in PHP if it makes sense to make it in PHP. Finally, if you're sitting there and you have an idea that you've been sitting on and you haven't done anything with it, do it. Ask yourself, what can you do with PHP? You can do a lot with it, and if you're sitting there for any reason other than not having time or whatever, great. If you're worried about whether or not you should create the project, stop worrying about it. Just do it. There's no reason not to, and if no one uses it, that's fine. It's no big deal. But don't let the fear of whether or not the community will accept it keep you from actually building something. That's it for now. Would love it if you could rate my talk on Joined In. Rate all the talks on Joined In, actually. Make sure you're logged in. If you're not logged in, it doesn't count. So that helps quite a bit. Unless you're going to leave a 1 to 3 star rating, in which case you can stay logged out. The slides are available online as well, if you want to check those out. And I have a podcast, which a friend of mine in the UK, Dave Marshall, and I have been doing a podcast called That Podcast. You can check that out as well. It'll be a lot of fun. I think that's it for now. Questions?
Hello, thank you. What are your next projects?
Next projects? Let's see what Sculpin. Sculpin has a whole bunch of features and functionality that I haven't been able to work on in like 6 months. So
okay, so this is a work in progress.
Yes, Sculpin is definitely a work in progress, and that's another thing too, is that I released it before it was done. It's never going to be done, I think, is another thing too. So it works. It's in use by a lot of people to build a lot of websites at this point, but it's not. It's definitely not done by any means.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, you release something people can use, so a tool or so Sculpin here. How do you know when people start adopting it? Apart from pull requests you may get, or?
So it's actually an interesting story. The first time that I realized that people were using it that I didn't know were using it was when I met someone in person. I shook their hand, got their name, and I went and Googled them to find them on Twitter and found their website, and it looked really familiar. And it had been based on my blog's template. So they had actually cloned my Sculpin blog and replaced the contents with their posts. And that was pretty much when I realized that, wow, there are actually people, like I've met someone in person that uses Sculpin now that I didn't know, and they didn't know that I had written Sculpin. So that was kind of like the first moment where I realized that there's more than like the 5 people in the IRC channel that use Sculpin. That was an interesting moment for me, because I've never really had a project like this before where people were using it. So yeah, you don't really know. You can look at like packages installs, but that can be tainted by like Travis installs or whatever, so you can't really trust that. But actually meeting someone who uses it that you didn't even know them beforehand, and they didn't know you, and all of a sudden you find out they use the project. I think that was the moment where I realized, okay, yeah, this is actually out in the wild and people are using it now. that answer the question?
Yeah,
Okay.
and then is that something you put forward to show people that this is a tool that is actually being used, and by this, well, at this side, this side?
Yes. So one of the things I did sort of early on was started to create a list of sites that use Sculpin, so that when people would visit the site, they would realize, hey, there's actually projects or there's other websites using this. But at a certain point, I stopped maintaining that because people stopped caring and no longer pushing code to that. So there's not new sites being added to the community list. Before that, I think a lot of what I did was just talking about it to people. Anytime someone would mention a static site generator, I would mention Sculpin. I started mentioning it more often and saying, hey, did you check out my project? Or you could check out this project, it's kind of interesting. I started to push it more in the Composer channels as well, talking about embedded Composer, and anytime anything remotely related came up, I would start mentioning Sculpin by name and start mentioning what it did so that more people in the channel might see and talk about it or ask about it. And I actually found a lot of people that way. They were like, oh, what is that you're talking about? And then they would end up in the Sculpin IRC channel, and next thing I know, they'd be sending a pull request, or they'd say, oh, how do you do this? And I'd realize that they were actually building a website in Sculpin.
Hi. A big part of the success of Sculpin seems to come from the fact that you are involved with the community. Mm. And I'd like to know how much time do you spend being involved with the community, sending mails, answering on mailing list, compared to the time you spend coding? What is a good ratio for you?
Well, right now I spend more time doing community things than writing code for Sculpin. Because pretty much, like I said, for 6 months I haven't been able to really do a whole lot at all, except maybe merge pull requests. But that is probably another big thing, is the whole community aspect. I've tried to make myself more visible. I've been attending conferences, I've been speaking at conferences, I've been talking about it to everybody that will listen about Sculpin. If anything comes up, what are you working on? It's like, well, I have a project Sculpin. I've been trying to talk up both Sculpin and Stack as things that are things that I work on. And yeah, so I think community definitely has played a big part in it. And being at conferences, talking to people, definitely being a part of PHP Fig has probably helped quite a bit as far as like exposure.